3 of you have tried to kill me in the past, 1 of you succeeded. Hello everyone, welcome to episode number 71 of Movies Are Awesome, the show all about fish and chips. My name is Nathan Pottle, and thank you so much for joining me today. We're coming near to the end of the summer here. We're in the start of August now, and if I'm counting backwards to March, from March to now has been 5 months, which means for 5 months I have been jobless. And now I finally got a new job, and I will be starting that in a couple of weeks here. So I'm pretty excited to be starting my new line of employment. Like I said, it's in 2 weeks, and I don't know how that's going to really affect my schedule and how this new job is going to affect the podcast as a whole. But I do plan on continuing to do the podcast and make it because I really enjoy making it, and there are people out there who listen, so that's really cool. But I don't know as of yet if this new job will make any great changes to how the podcast works or its schedule or anything like that. I will keep you guys updated and posted on that, but that's just really, really exciting. What else is exciting is next week I am flying out to Ontario where my brother lives, and he is getting married. Him and his fiance, they live out in Ontario, which is about a 4 or 5 hour flight for us, so it's pretty exciting that we get to go there. So by the time next week's episode comes out, I will already be there. But I'm not there for a very long time because I have to come back for my new job. So it really lines up nicely that I'll record an episode of the podcast, I'll fly out, and I'll be able to come home and do another episode in time for the next schedule, and then also for when I start my new job. So there's not going to be any kind of change in the schedule. Episodes are going to come out on Friday for the next few weeks. And that's kind of all the things I want to talk about. What I'm talking about today in the bulk of the show is movies that still hold up. Last week I talked about movies that don't hold up anymore. So definitely I think it's only fair to talk about movies that do hold up. Now, I didn't want to just talk about the same movies over and over and over again, movies that you've heard me mention on the show a million times. Like, obviously, The Lord of the Rings still holds up. Obviously, Jurassic Park still holds up. Movies like that. So what I've done is I picked 5 movies that I have actually talked about on the show before. They are part of the 100 must-watch movie list that I did across 4 episodes. But because that was a list of 100 movies, I didn't really have time to get a little more in-depth into each of these films and what they're about and why they hold up. So I've picked 5 movies from that list that I'm going to sit down and talk about today, and I'm going to do the same thing I did last week. We're going to talk about them in release orders. The first one is Modern Times, and that came out in 1936. It's a Charlie Chaplin movie. If you're not familiar with the name Charlie Chaplin, you're probably familiar with his look. He has a tiny little mustache, a bowler hat, and a suit, and he waddles around. He's a very funny but a very talented filmmaker at the same time. Now, what's interesting about Modern Times is that it is a silent film. It's in black and white, and it's just music, and you sometimes have title cards in front of the screen telling you like lines of dialogue here and there, but mostly it's all visual. And that is what I really like about this movie, is it's a lot of show, don't tell. It's a lot of visual gags. Charlie Chaplin was really famous for his humor and how he was able to use the camera in order to tell humorous things and do really funny stuff that people really hadn't done or seen before. He was really a pioneer of using film cameras in order to do comedy in new and interesting ways. And there's a really, really cool behind the scenes thing. If you follow movie channels or anything on Facebook or Instagram, I'm sure you've seen this video of Charlie Chaplin on a pair of rollerblades, and he's getting dangerously close to going over this large edge, and he's roller skating backwards, and he goes back and forth and back and forth, and every time he comes dangerously close to the edge, and it looks 100% like this is real and it was filmed all on camera. But the behind the scenes of how they shot that he was actually completely safe the entire time. But when you're watching it, it's completely convincing that he is on this pair of rollerblades and he is going to fall over the edge and really hurt himself. But the way that they use force perspective in this movie is really, really good. Basically, the plot of Modern Times is that Charlie Chaplin is the tramp, and he is working in a factory and just trying to get through life and enjoy the little things. And he meets up with this homeless woman, and they just have a good time together, and it's really fun, it's really delightful, and I think that this movie is really beautiful in its simplicity, if that makes sense. Like they're not telling a big sweeping story like The Lord of the Rings or Ben-Hur. This isn't something that is huge in scale. It's just a little story about these two people living their lives as ordinary people, but they keep it interesting and they amuse themselves. And I think that that's something that can be really relatable to a lot of people nowadays, even though it's in black and white and it's a silent film. I think it really has something that everyone can relate to. So that's why Modern Times, I feel, is a movie that still holds up. We'll move on now to my second one. So Modern Times was 1936. Then we jump to 1957, and that's 12 Angry Men. I've talked about this one on the show a few times. Basically, what 12 Angry Men is about, it is 12 jurors who are deliberating whether someone is guilty or not guilty in a trial. And they lay out all of the facts that they have, and the entire movie is these 12 men in a room discussing whether this person is guilty or not guilty. And what I really like about it is that all of these problem-solving techniques and the way that they think through everything can absolutely be applied to our normal lives and how we look at things, and whether we asperse judgment on someone or not really comes through in the script and how the different characters interact with each other. These are 12 men, but a lot of them are really distinct and you can tell who is who. And what's also really interesting is that none of these characters have names. They're referred to juror 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. They just have numbers. And so they refer to themselves as juror number 12, juror number 5, juror number 4. And I find that really interesting that they don't have actual names. They have labels, and they all have different viewpoints, and it's all fascinating to see this entire thing unfold, especially for a movie that all takes place in a single room. Like, this is an hour and a half in the same location, and you don't see anything change. You just have different camera angles, and there you go. I want to compare this to another movie that I recently watched. My Dinner with Andre is another movie that also takes place in one location. It's just two men sitting at a table having dinner, and they're just having a conversation. And for an hour and 50 minutes, that is the entire thing. Now, I watched My Dinner with Andre just last night for the very first time. I'd never seen it before, and I didn't love it. A lot of people out there really, really like this movie, and they have a lot of great things to say about it. But for myself, it was so boring to look at. I could have listened to this movie in its entirety and not have lost anything, because the characters, they're literally just sitting and talking, and the camera angles are very basic. But what 12 Angry Men does, and maybe because it has a lot more characters and a lot of different ideas being thrown back and forth, but it's an open discussion for the entire time. When it comes to My Dinner with Andre, basically the first 45 minutes is one guy telling a really long story, and then they start to have a discussion. And once they start to have a discussion, it gets really, really interesting. But unfortunately, that first 45 minutes of him just telling the story of all of his travels is not that interesting. But back to 12 Angry Men, we have everyone voicing their opinions and speaking up. It's all very balanced, I feel. The cinematographer obviously used this room to the best of his ability, putting the cameras in a bunch of different places. We get a lot of close-ups, we get a lot of wide shots of the entire room with everyone in it. We get some dolly shots of the camera moving around amongst all of the people. It really was visually interesting for something that takes place in a single room, which compared to My Dinner with Andre was not the same at all. And then I think what maybe I like most about 12 Angry Men is that it's a movie that really, it makes you think about, do we take everything that's said for granted, or should we dig a little deeper and think about things? And then we have a reasonable doubt, and what reasonable doubt is, and how we can apply that. And it's just really good on a philosophical level. It's interesting to watch. The cast is really great. So 12 Angry Men from 1957 is a really great movie. It absolutely still holds up. I actually wish I had a copy of this on Blu-ray. I should probably buy it for myself. I got it from the library is how I watched it, but it's just so good. I need to get a copy of it for myself. Maybe I'll just buy it digitally. I don't know. But we'll move on to my third one, which is The Apartment from 1960. And this one is directed by Billy Wilder, who have, if you listened to my episode on directors, he is my second favorite director of all time. I love his movies. I think they're just so well put together and so well thought out. He is an excellent writer and director. And basically, the story of The Apartment is Jack Lemmon's character, C.C. Banks or something like that, he's named. He wants to rise up in his company, and basically, how he's doing that is letting his managers and his bosses use his apartment to take their mistresses and use his apartment to fool around in, and then they go home to their wives. And he just sits outside while they use his apartment. And then he meets a woman who works at the same building, and then they form a romance, and it's causes all kinds of complications and mix-ups. It's very funny but dramatic at the same time. This movie did win Best Picture in 1960 when it came out, and I think largely that has to do with the writing and the direction, but also the cast. Jack Lemmon and Shirley MacLaine, who are the leads of this movie, they are excellent, and I think that this story, probably more than the other ones on my list, is the most relatable, because who doesn't want to be successful at their workplace? Who doesn't want to rise up in the ranks at work and maybe get a bigger paycheck and maybe not have to work as hard for everything, right? So I think that that is something that a lot of people can really relate to, and I think that's part of the reason why this movie holds up so well, is because you can put yourself in the shoes of Jack Lemmon's character and like see why he's making the choices that he is. Maybe you wouldn't necessarily make those same choices, but at least you can understand where he's coming from. It has been quite a while since I've watched this movie. I should give it a rewatch because it is just excellent. I highly recommend The Apartment from 1960. We'll move on, though. I'm going through this list pretty quick here, but that's fine. It's as long as it needs to be. The next one from 1972 is The Godfather, also winner of Best Picture. I don't think I really need to describe what The Godfather is about. I think most people are familiar with it, even if they haven't seen it. But just to be safe, The Godfather is about a crime family, and the leader of the crime family, who is played by Marlon Brando, he is kind of getting ready to retire, and his son, who's played by Al Pacino, kind of takes up the mantle of the crime family, but he does so reluctantly. Like, he doesn't really want to have this life of crime, but he's almost kind of thrust into it, and then he takes the burden upon himself, and it's the descent of his character and the retirement of this other character, and it's this big story with these crime families going to war with each other. It's really fascinating. The performances are all fantastic. Marlon Brando won the Academy Award for his performance, but he very famously declined it. I can't remember off the top of my head the exact circumstances of him declining his Academy Award, but he did not attend the ceremony. And it had something to do with Native American rights or something like that, because he had a Native American woman like go up on stage for him when he won, and she said something. Oh man, I should have gone to write it down because I'm not doing this story justice. Just go look it up. Marlon Brando denying his Academy Award for The Godfather. It's a very famous story. You can find it and look it up. I just can't remember the exact details right now. I'll look it up a little bit later, and I'll facepalm myself for not completely remembering. But what The Godfather did is it really started this kind of crime drama genre, you know? Basically, we wouldn't have Scorsese movies from the 90s if not for The Godfather in 1972. And there's a whole lot of other crime dramas. And then obviously there's The Godfather Part 2, which is also excellent, and The Godfather Part 3, which is less good. I don't think it's completely awful. It's just not worth watching. The Godfather, though, it's really great. You should watch it. It's violent, so just letting you know there that it's a violent movie. People are getting shot. It's not super gory and bloody, so you don't have to worry about that, except for the part with a horse head. So like that part's pretty bloody, but for the most part, this movie's pretty tame, and it's just the words of these people and the actions. But it's not like watching a Tarantino movie where someone gets shot and the blood is flying everywhere. It's not like that. But it is good though. You should watch it. It's a movie that holds up. Even 1972, so this movie's almost 40 years old. Or am I doing bad math? This movie's almost 50 years old. Yeah, in a couple of years, this movie will be 50 years old. That is That's pretty crazy how time flies. But anyway, I only have one more left today, and I'm flying through these. Maybe I should have wrote down some more notes on what to say about these movies, but it's fine. These are great movies, and you should just go watch them. And the last one is Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Now, I chose this one specifically because I think it's the best of the Indiana Jones movies. This is the third one. If you're not familiar with the order, it's Raiders of the Lost Ark, and then Temple of Doom, and then Last Crusade. And this one came out in 1989. And this movie holds up for a few different reasons. Now, one is the visual effects. This was done by ILM. It still looks pretty good. You can definitely tell that things are fake, but obviously this movie came out in 1989. It's 30 years old, right? So it happens. Another reason that this movie still holds up is it, at its heart, this is a father and son story about Indiana Jones and his dad, who is played by Sean Connery, who gives a great performance. And it's interesting because Sean Connery is actually only 12 years older than Harrison Ford, but in this movie they play a father and son. So there's not much of an age gap between them, or certainly not enough for them to actually be father and son. But they do have such a good dynamic, and it's super believable. Also, this movie has that great opening scene with River Phoenix, Joaquin Phoenix's brother, who then passed away shortly after this movie came out. I don't think it was much long after this that he died tragically. But the opening scene with him as young Indiana Jones, and how he got the whip and how he got the hat and he got the scar on his chin that Harrison Ford actually has, but they incorporated it into the Indiana Jones character. It's all so good. And so we got the visual effects and the father and son story, and then the great opening scene. But what I think most lets this movie hold up is it feels timeless in nature, you know? Like, obviously it takes place in the 1940s, but they're exploring things that are much, much older. So when you're kind of going on this swashbuckling adventure almost, and like going through these ancient places, it doesn't really label it in any kind of time zone. Even though there are Nazis running around and things like that, it still has that timeless feel to it. It's like when I'm watching The Lord of the Rings, I'm not beholden to any decade. When I'm watching Indiana Jones, I'm not saying, okay, this is a late 80s movie. I'm not stuck in that time zone. It's a period piece, but it's still timeless. And then obviously just the whole sprawling adventure and finding the Ark of the Covenant and all the different clues that they put together. It's all fantastic. I love Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. I love actually most of the Indiana Jones movies, except for Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, because it's not a good movie. But that being said, those are the reasons Last Crusade really holds up. And the movie is fantastic. All these movies are fantastic. That's all. I already talked about all five. Oh my goodness. So here we go. I'll just list them off one more time. Modern Times from 1936, 12 Angry Men, 1957, The Apartment, 1960, The Godfather, 1972, and Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade from 1989. So that's it for today. I will just quickly wrap things up here. What I'd like to hear from you guys is, what movies do you think still hold up? Whatever those are, please let me know. You can reach out to me. You can find me on social media. I'm on Twitter at Pottle Nathan, and you can find the show on Instagram at Movies Are Awesome Podcast. You can also email the show. All that information is in the show notes below. If you haven't done so, please feel free to subscribe to the show. You can do so on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and a whole bunch of other places. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. It means a lot to me that you stick around and listen to me ramble about a few movies every week. And of course, if you have nothing else to do, go watch more movies.